All right, welcome to this week's Tech Insights series. This week we are talking about application refactoring. This is a little bit of a build on what we talked about last week with containers. Welcome to our webinar this week. We have some excellent guests, as always. First, I'm Nathan Lesnowski. I'm Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer. And with me this week, we have Brian Hayden, and not to be confused with Brian Chatola. So Brian Hayden is a managing architect with Concurrency. He's been with us for some time. Welcome, Brian, to the webinar this week.
Thanks, Nathan.
And then we also have Brian Chatola, also a managing architect with Concurrency. He is joining us this week for the first time on the webinar.
Thanks for having me, Nate.
Awesome. So let's get started. So this week we're going to talk about application refactoring, and we'll talk a little bit about why application refactoring is important for cloud migration. We'll have a deep dive into re-architecting best practices, particularly different use cases as to why you would go about refactoring a particular application and the types of refactoring that you would do. And then a little bit about how to avoid common pitfalls and unnecessary costs in the context of those different types of refactoring scenarios. Next week, don't miss our webinar on manufacturing IP solutions. This is going to be a very special, in 2 weeks, October 22nd. This is going to be a very special session because we're going to be joined with Michael Walton from Microsoft, who is an expert in the manufacturing vertical. He happens to be attached to some of Microsoft's core manufacturing accounts. He has a wealth of knowledge, is going to be around to talk about manufacturing IP solutions. We'll be talking about creating a resilient supply chain, improving customer engagement via manufacturing, and then also identifying innovations that drive new revenue or improved operational profits. So do not miss that. It's not just for manufacturing customers. If you're in logistics, if you make something and sell something, if you're in supply chain, there's so many companies that would be a good fit for that webinar. So do not miss it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about application refactoring. Just to kick us off here, there's a couple different types of options that we see companies thinking about as they go about a cloud migration. And these different options are not necessarily a kind of either or in a sense that they're a both and sometimes. So the first option that we see companies doing is lift and shift. The idea that I'm taking existing workloads, I'm moving those existing workloads to the cloud, and I'm moving them as is. And there's a lot of reasons why companies do that. Maybe they're trying to exit the data center because their contract is ending, or there's an M&A activity, or there's a need for them to simply modernize their approach to executing on infrastructure workloads, and they want to start doing infrastructure as code and understanding how to do micro network segmentation around those workloads. So the lift and shift story becomes really relevant, and that's one way people move to the cloud. Another way, and this is at the bottom, is this new development. Maybe I'm less interested in doing lift and shift, but perhaps anything that's new, I'm building in the cloud. We had a conversation last week about containers, and typically, if you're doing container development, you're doing that container development within the cloud. So that new development, that target for cloud migrations may be simply anything new goes there, but for the time being, maybe we're leaving some things on premise. So in between is our topic for today. Our topic for today is around the idea of refactoring an existing platform, meaning I'm taking workloads that exist in an on-premise environment, or maybe are new workloads that I had built in a certain way, and I'm refactoring aspects of that workload to be able to take advantage of the cloud environment, but maybe not refactoring everything within the application itself. So we're going to go through a series of kind of questions that are tied to these different types of refactoring problems. And I think Brian and Brian Chatola are going to be a great fit for answering those questions. So let's start out with a kind of entry question here. How are companies making the decision on application refactoring? Well, how are they deciding to go about going down this road, guys?
So I guess I'll go first, and you can't really call us out by Brian because we're both going to start if that happens. So, Brian Stoll did a great job of actually kind of laying this out. Most of the time when we're talking about entry into the cloud, we're talking about a cost savings. And but there's a lot of different reasons why you might go into it. Some of it happens to be that most modern development is happening in the cloud. You brought up containers, which is, where I see a lot of momentum going at this point. And the deployment for the cloud, deployment for containers is really naturally just made for the cloud. But probably the biggest overall factor that I can see companies making that decision is on cost and simplifying their own internal data centers or getting rid of their internal data centers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, cost is always one of the first things we look at. But once we move past cost, there's some more intricacies into wanting to move to the cloud. A lot of it can be, scale is another one, risk, and development techniques and new technologies. So, you can see what we have on the screen here is some of the new technologies that are available in Azure as offerings. So, we've got existing applications that have been running for a while that are built on the current technology of the day, and now technologies move beyond that. So now it presents an opportunity for us to take a look at different ways that we can restructure our application to take advantage of these cloud services, again, potentially to reduce costs, to reduce risk, and to change our development techniques. DevOps and continuous delivery and infrastructure as code are now things that we can take care of on some of these technologies that you see here.
Awesome, thanks guys. So on these 6 scenarios, we're going to now dive into each of them and ask some questions about sort of everything from refactoring on SQL and managed instance through to ideas of containers or identity, app services, and so on. So we'll talk about each of these now. Awesome. So Hayden and Shatola, why would you want to consider refactoring for the cloud into cloud native? So if you're thinking about refactoring or refactoring in the cloud native, why would you consider doing that?
Yeah, so I think this kind of builds off the last question that we were talking about, the different technologies, different techniques that we were talking about, right? But also taking a look at how your application is built and starting to separate your application, start to separate concerns. When you start to look at cloud technologies, you'll see that there's offerings, there's PaaS and infrastructure offerings for compute and for data storage. And when we think of legacy applications, sometimes we end up with these monolithic applications where everything is baked into one thing. And that causes deployment problems where now when you want to change one part of your application, you've got to change everything. So cloud and cloud native in particular allows us to separate those pieces of the application, to separate that storage from the compute, and to separate compute from compute. And we'll get into more of that with VMs and containers, app services, serverless, things like that. But allows you to have more control over how you release code and how you develop code. Makes for an interesting development.
Do you think part of it is, kind of in the idea of building blocks that when we develop something, we're always working with building blocks at some level. Because most of us aren't doing assembler coding, right? But there's some level of the cloud offering building blocks that I don't have to recreate certain layers. And maybe once I start to lean on the cloud on an identity layer or a storage layer or a compute layer or an app hosting layer, I start to make that more of a commodity for me to accelerate application development. Is that kind of one of the domains that you're talking about?
Sure. So yeah, well, I think you bring up a really good point. And as an architect, I'm always looking for opportunities to scale my application and reuse code for other purposes. So when we talk about the effort of actually refactoring it, part of it is, do we come up with a strategy of moving this entire application? But oftentimes it's looking across your entire platform and looking for, what's the first thing that I need to migrate over. We'll talk about identity a little bit later here in the webinar, but that's a really good thing where you might want to start. Hey, I've got all these different user IDs that are coming in and are unique to each system that people might be logging into. Is this an opportunity for us to build something in the cloud that actually leverages the technologies that are there for that particular reason? So in the context of this particular question and refactoring and why would you do that, going back to what Brian alluded to with scale, performance, not having to manage the infrastructure. Those are all great reasons why you would do that. But then on top of that, add into this equation, I have something that's going to be used by a lot of different systems, and this is something I want to move to the cloud because it's going to provide a lot of benefit, the benefit of the scale that the cloud provides.
Awesome. All right, so talking about a specific instance here, when might a company refactor into something like Azure SQL or managed instance or Cosmos database, something along those lines?
Sure. So data is typically one of the components of an application that can be segmented without a lot of disruption. There's the ability to have your on-prem network, point to the cloud and have a secure connection that you don't have to necessarily be too afraid of. Azure does a great job of whitelisting and firewalling a lot of traffic that would normally be a problem. So, so from a security standpoint, it's easy to lift and shift. Most applications have just a simple connection string, and so if that connection string is in an off-prem Azure cloud environment, that really doesn't affect most development. So it's a quick win. If you really want to just move something and see what it's going to do, a database is the easiest. When we start talking about the different offerings in Azure, whether it's Azure SQL native or managed instance. I mean, there's a bunch of different considerations why you'd want to do one or the other. Azure SQL is great. It works for if you just need data and you need to be able to connect to it and store it. Azure SQL is great. If you are trying to migrate your existing SQL server, you might want to consider managed instance if you're using some of the more advanced features like different procedures, or if you have SSIS packages or jobs in SQL that you need to run. Those aren't supported in the traditional PaaS offering of Azure SQL, but they are supported in managed instance. Cosmos, again, if you're already using a NoSQL environment, that's a great option for you to sort of do this pseudo lift and shift. You're just changing where the service lives and resides. But yeah, it's my.
Yeah, I think when you talk about Azure SQL too, and anything with going to the cloud or cloud native too, I think the question that you need to ask yourself is how much control do you need anymore, right? We're used to legacy environments in which you've got full control over your server, but I think a question you need to ask yourself is do you need that, right? Are you in the business of running your environment, or can you switch over to an environment like this, a hosted environment for you to allow someone else to take some of that control? So if you are in a position where you can relinquish some of that control, moving to one of these hosted solutions might be again more cost beneficial.
One other point that I want to make here is that most of our clients that aren't in the Fortune 50 or Fortune 100 don't have a lot of dedicated like DBAs and SQL administrators, on hand or on staff. And so moving to, an Azure environment here makes a lot of sense because you get a lot of the backups, you get a lot of the patching, all that, out of the box, and you don't have to worry about it. So that would also be a very strong consideration.
That's a good point. All right, so the next domain is about identity. So when might a company think about refactoring into things like Azure Active Directory B2C or B2B, and understand when that might make sense for their application?
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity here. We could do an entire webinar on this topic. This question alone.
How much time you got?
Yeah, we don't. I'll try to keep it really short, as much as I can. So the short answer here is that this is probably the first thing that you need to address when you're moving to the cloud, and whatever your cloud provider. But Azure in particular has a lot of great tools, including a new one which is external identities that bridges somewhat of the gap between Azure B2C and B2B. But in terms of why would you want to do this, I alluded to this earlier, where a lot of traditional application development has users being managed locally within a SQL Server form type of authentication, and that works fine if you're doing some internal applications. But once you start to get outside into the cloud and having external people using your application, security becomes much more risky for you to take on as you know, an internal development process. So I can pretty much guarantee that most companies that are out there don't have a security expert on staff. And so leverage the experts and use Azure AD or B2C or B2B. Any one of these services are going to basically take care of that intellectual capacity that you aren't going to have internally. Azure B2B and B2C are both great options if you're going to be working with external customers. Think of, you have a subscription service that people are going to subscribe to, and you don't want to have those users being managed through your Azure Active Directory. B2B is B2C, I should say, is a great example of that. Also, B2C provides a lot of elegant customizations, so you can have a really unique brand for your company. Whereas when you use B2B or external identities in AD, those are typically a little bit more Microsoft-focused branding.
Yeah, I think you really hit on something too that's pervasive throughout all this is expertise, right? So that's really what you get with a lot of these cloud environments. If you're not an expert, if you're not a company that's an expert in that, it may not be, again, cost effective for you to hire that expert. So, you know, again, something like what Brian said with security, that's a very sensitive topic, and there's people that do nothing but specialize in that. So recommending, you know, you utilize those professionals for you know, what they specialize in.
Yeah, this is a hard domain to have specialty in as well. Identity and its relationship to security is a strange sort of coalescing of development and infrastructure, and having a person that really understands that and has the skill to be able to build something custom in this space is pretty tricky. And it's beneficial to a lot of companies to be able to lean on the work that's gone before in a Azure AD versus having to kind of try to construct this layer themselves.
Yeah, you're going to trust the 3 developers you have on staff or the 3,000 that Microsoft has.
Right.
Right.
All right. Here's a pretty relevant topic for a lot of developers. Where might web applications move into Azure Web Apps?
Yeah, so this, you know, we're talking about a particular offering here with Azure, and to me this scenario, this is really the Super Bowl scenario, right? You've got a web application, and you may get hit, you know, the Super Bowl scenario where all of a sudden your traffic spikes. You don't need a lot of, you know, heavy volume. You don't have a lot of heavy volume most of the time, but sometimes you get that. So moving into web apps, into managed services like this, gives your application the ability to scale like that without having to throw a bunch of hardware at it. You know, it doesn't make sense to have most web applications that, for the most part, are running idle, to be running on heavy servers that you have to in order to handle that load once in a while. So this really is a cost and flexibility solution, I would say.
Yeah, Brian brings up a really good point. Unless you're going to be retiring an entire server, and most IIS servers that are locally deployed might have 10, 15, 20, or 100 websites that are running on it. I would choose ones that have traffic issues over ones that are, you know, the simple accounting application that has 1 or 2 users that gets used at the end of the month, right? So use the scale and being able to dynamically scale as needed as kind of a decision point would be a good guidance. But in terms of what can be, I would also add that most applications that are .NET based or even, you know, other technologies can be hosted in web apps as well. You know, Python, you know, pretty much most of the modern technologies can be migrated to web apps. So most of your web-based technologies are going to be candidates for moving to Azure Web Apps.
Okay.
And people might ask, you know, well, how do we make that decision between that? You know, I would say that for the most part, for the ease, the cost savings, things like that, if it can be migrated to a hosted service, migrate it to a hosted service. If you're looking to refactor something, you need to make a change in it. I would say, for the most part, I think going default now and saying we're gonna offload this to a managed service to run this is probably a better default decision than continuing to run it in-house these days.
Awesome, thanks. So this is sort of a partner to the previous question, and maybe in contrast, be really interesting to understand this is where might an environment be refactored into containers? And in particular, are there scenarios where containers are sometimes overused for the scenario, or is there a contrast against this with the web app answer that we just had? Like, where might containers be a good refactor direction versus maybe refactoring into web apps, or is a scenario maybe not the right fit for containers? So a lot of little different directions to go here. Love to get your take on this.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this, Nate, last time when we talked about containers, right? And I had, I had this slide that talked about the monolithic applications and a transition to microservices, and where containers, kind of is this natural evolution. So in terms, yeah, perfect. So in terms of where and why containers, I look at smaller components. If you're already doing a microservice architecture, or if you've refactored and identified something that is a microservice, I think considering moving that to a container right off the bat is probably, a logical step. And the answer, the next question would be why containers? And we talked a lot about that last time. But this is the more generally practiced, or this is the direction that everybody's going at this point, is in terms of container development. It gives scale, your ability for your application to scale just another level, right? So, but that's why I would do this is if you could identify isolated components that can live on their own and stand on their own 2 feet, that would be when you want to use containers.
Yeah. If you talk to, there's a good faction of people in the industry that will say that if it can be containerized, containerize it. That again, that's sort of the new default in a lot of people's eyes. Not really an advantage to not containerizing it. The advantage that you really get from containers is eliminating that scenario where you move up through environments. You move from a dev to a QA up to a production environment. And we've all been there. When you roll out to production, all of a sudden nothing's working, right? The configuration's not right on the machines. We can never match the production environment configuration settings in lower environments. The advantage of containers is that theoretically it is a build once, run exactly the same everywhere. So you can run the exact same production environment on your developers' machines when they're building on day one versus when it actually gets released to production. So there's a lot of development advantages while you go through the process, as well as keeping consistent environments up through production for more predictable deployments.
Awesome. All right, so this is a little bit of a shift from the ideas around containers and web apps, but it's something that comes up quite a bit. So where might integrations be rebuilt into things like logic apps? There's a couple different technologies here, but especially integrations that were heavily on-premise built. Maybe they lived in BizTalk, things that were in the on-prem environment being rebuilt into platforms like logic apps.
Yeah, so I was talking at the beginning about separating storage from compute and then compute from compute. This is where that separating compute from compute comes in, and to start leveraging different logic that's in your application. If you have, you have a certain well-known scenario, well-known algorithm within your application, input output type of scenario. Logic apps is perfect for that. So breaking that out to make that more easily understood and separated from your application. Again, from deployment perspectives, if you can separate logic out of a monolithic application into separate logic applications, now when you need to make a change to a flow that's happening in just one of those, you can just modify that. You don't have to go and modify something in this monolithic application, roll everything back out, retest everything. So again, you get a little bit more control in this case over the implementation by separating things a bit.
Yeah, I like the fact that Logic apps have hundreds of connectors that are out of the box that allow you to connect to your CRM platform or Salesforce, and Salesforce, I should say. There's just so many different connectors that are out there that allow you to flow information from one application to another to create take care of, I should say, those interdependencies between your applications.
Awesome. Let's talk a little bit about background processes and maybe even foreground processes that are kind of moving into the idea of, maybe you hesitate to say even past containers in a sense, into serverless computing, whether it's running in Azure Functions or some other serverless computing model. Like where should we start looking at the refactoring moving into that space?
Azure Functions, to me, these serverless components like this are some of the most underutilized offerings within Azure right now. Again, you talk about the different connectors that are there, how you can tie your functions in Azure Functions to, Cosmos DB record updates, or whatever queue technology you might want to be using, or even a file watcher. So anytime that you have some background process within your organization that's looking for something to happen and then it triggers an event, I would say that is 100% a candidate for Azure Functions. Another thing to consider about this is, I brought up like Cosmos triggers that allow you to update when a record's updated. Think of what the impacts of that might be in terms of scale. And I've seen applications that may fire off thousands of events within a couple of seconds. And the scaling ability of Azure Functions to be able to handle that workload is immense. I mean, it can spin up hundreds of instances in seconds. And so from that standpoint, that scale problem is handled for you pretty much out of the box.
Yeah, Azure Functions too pair really well with Logic apps. So when you get into Logic apps, if there's not a built-in connector, or if you need to do something custom while a flow is working, you can pair that with an Azure function to sort of shell out to that functionality, execute that custom logic that you have there, and then come back into your Logic app and continue that flow. Remember, these kind of solutions are really perfect for stateless compute that you have. So remember, anything that you are refactoring into this, if it is stateful, then Azure Functions probably isn't going to be right for you. But if it's a compute function that you can do, it can be a perfect candidate.
Mm-hmm. That's sort of a characteristics of most things that you're trying to refactor, right? I mean, containers, app services, functions, they're all kind of moving toward this a stateless model in a sense.
Right. Yeah, and the ability to self-heal, right? So when we start talking about containers and Kubernetes, right, the purpose of Kubernetes is really there. A large purpose is to self-heal. So when when a container goes down or when a node goes down, Kubernetes is always watching over that to make sure that that comes back up again. So yeah, when you are looking at refactoring for cloud native, understanding how to build resiliency into your applications to be able to handle those outages and be able to handle your compute sort of rolling on and off as it might happen to do is important to consider.
Mm-hmm. We have a few extra minutes here. I have a question that's based on kind of the aggregate of these. We've dug into a couple, I guess at a cursory level, a whole bunch of different scenarios. Where do you think the lowest hanging fruit tends to be in customer environments? When you're looking at migrating, is it the DevOps transformation? Is it moving into SQL? Is it identity? Like, is it kind of are there certain scenarios that edge towards something? Like where would you say companies should look for the low hanging fruit in the refactor?
Man, that's a loaded question.
It is.
So I'm going to say that the least low-hanging fruit is identity. That's the most complex, but it's also the first thing that you should be looking at and coming up with a strategy around. But in terms of low-hanging fruit, You know, if you have .NET based applications that you currently have, most of those transitions are going to go pretty smooth, and those are low hanging fruit. You can start to retire your own hardware and get that workload off of your IT department, and move that quickly as quickly as you can. So I would look for those kind of opportunities to get things migrated with the least amount of refactoring effort as the lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah, and I would use use the cloud environment and cloud native and start refactoring in order to, again, start pushing your development teams to be able to release quicker. You know, it's that DevOps, it's being able to release quicker, release with less risk, release in different pieces again. So we have less to test when we go. If we start breaking things apart into different pieces, now we don't have to, you know, retest the entire application. You get a lot more advantages for delivering value quicker that way.
Yeah, big time. Even that's even the case in lift and shift migrations where, you know, when we move a legacy workload over, we're still implementing infrastructure as code. We're still implementing micro network segmentation. You know, you're just kind of building qualities of what truly refactored applications look like. I mean,
Yeah.
you can use that migration as a real catalyst.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Brian and Brian Squared, you guys are awesome. Thank you for the time that you spent today. These guys are really providing a lot of knowledge in a short period of time here. So thank you for that.
Thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you.
For next steps, we would love to meet one-on-one with Concurrency and you to discuss how a well thought out application refactoring plan can benefit your cloud migration. This is a typical part of looking at what your cloud journey looks like. There's always an aspect of lift and shift. There's always an aspect of refactor and new cloud development, as well as doing nothing and leaving certain things where they are. And one of the things that we do best is help companies to navigate that journey between all those different choices. So we would love to meet with you on that topic, to talk more about the ideas of refactoring specific to these ideas, as well as the broader story of your cloud journey. Then also upcoming webinars, October 22nd and November 5th. October 22nd is about manufacturing IP. Don't miss that one. There's a lot of focus on above the line savings in revenue and in operational cost savings. A lot of benefit in terms of how we can accelerate that. Michael Walton is a great asset to this conversation. It will be a great webinar, so don't miss it. And then also on Thursday, November 5th, we'll be talking about Windows Virtual Desktop and why companies are moving from Citrix over to Windows Virtual Desktop, and you know, whether that's driving their organization. So don't miss those. There's great conversations coming up. Also visit concurrency.com for our blogs, videos, and all of our past webinars that are recorded. Again, thank you to Brian and Brian for the great conversation today, and we will see you in 2 weeks.